Welcome and good evening. Tonight, we take a quiet walk through the gentle streets of suburban Colorado, where trimmed lawns and cul-de-sacs give the impression that all is calm and all is well. But as we so often find in these stories, appearances can be deceiving. This is a tale that doesn't begin with chaos. There are no police sirens screaming through the dark, no frantic calls in the night, just a porch light, softly glowing in the early hours of morning, and a silence that grows heavier with each passing hour. In this silence lives a family, one that seemed, at first glance, to have it all: smiling photos, 2 beautiful daughters, a 3rd child on the way, a house in the suburbs, a life, it seemed, full of ordinary joy. But beneath that quiet life, something darker had begun to stir. This is the story of Christopher Watts, a father, a husband, and ultimately, a man whose calm demeanor concealed something chilling. We will move gently through this story tonight, without shock, without gore, only soft details and steady steps, because this isn't a tale of monsters lurking in the shadows. It's a story of stillness, of slow unraveling, of how darkness can wear the calmest face of all. So settle in, let the world around you soften, and as the night drifts in, allow yourself to listen, not with fear, but with curiosity. You're safe here. This is the Dozing Detective. And tonight, we unravel the quiet horror behind a perfect facade. The story of Christopher Watts and the family who vanished beneath the silence. There's a certain kind of stillness that settles over suburban streets just before dawn. Streetlights flicker dimly over well-kept lawns. Homes rest in silence. The world hasn't quite stirred. It's in that silence, in that fragile in-between space, that this story begins. Frederick, Colorado, is the sort of town people move to when they're looking for a softer pace. A community framed by mountains, with cul-de-sacs and pickup trucks, soccer practices and Sunday cookouts. It's a town where people know their neighbors, where nothing loud seems to happen, where the darkness hums low and slow, and people feel safe leaving their porch lights on. It's also the place where Christopher and Shanann Watts were building a life. Married, 2 young daughters, and a 3rd child on the way. By all appearances, they were the picture of contentment. A smiling family in Facebook photos, posing at birthday parties, vacations, backyard barbecues. Their house, on Saratoga Trail, sat neatly among rows of similar homes. Vinyl siding, stone trim. A 2-car garage and a little porch light that blinked gently in the early hours of August 13th, 2018. That light would become important. It would shine on and off in police body cam footage. It would cast long shadows that hinted at something not quite right. Because by mid-morning, Shanann Watts, 34 years old, 17 weeks pregnant, was reported missing. Her friend had grown worried when she didn't respond to texts. She hadn't shown up for a scheduled doctor's appointment. Her car was still in the garage, purse inside. Her phone was at home, her shoes by the door. But there was no sign of her, or her daughters, Bella and Celeste. At first, it didn't make sense. Chris, her husband, seemed calm, concerned, but measured. He told police he'd left for work early that morning. He said Shanann had come home late from a work trip, and he hadn't really seen her. Maybe she'd gone to a friend's place. Maybe she needed space. But from the beginning, there was a quiet undercurrent, something uneasy in his voice, a little too flat, a little too polished, as though reading from a script practiced in the mirror. Neighbors noticed, officers noticed, and slowly, gently, the story began to unspool. This isn't a tale of monsters in the dark. There are no boogeymen or masked strangers here. Only a man, a family, and a decision that would fracture everything. It is a story told in soft tones and steady pacing. A story where the horror lies not in gore or spectacle, but in the slow, quiet unraveling of something that once looked so normal. Tonight, we drift down the quiet streets of Frederick, past tidy driveways and swaying porch swings, into a house where silence became a scream no one heard. This is the story of Christopher Watts and the family that vanished beneath the surface of a quiet life. Before the headlines, before the search parties, before the arrest, there were snapshots, hundreds of them, smiling faces, coordinated outfits, a family of 4, glowing with the soft sheen of digital filters and Facebook likes. Shanann Watts was the kind of woman who documented everything. From the first steps to school drop-offs, birthday cupcakes, to beach trips, every milestone, every memory lived somewhere online. Her social media pages were alive with affection, posts about her husband's support, her children's achievements, her hopes for the future. In these captured moments, her life seemed full, busy, joyful, thriving. But behind each image was a woman who had endured more than many knew. Born in Passaic, New Jersey, and raised in North Carolina, Shanann Razuchek was described by those who knew her as determined, energetic, and full of love. Her early years were shaped by challenges, health issues, personal struggles, but she met them with drive. Her family recalled how she had built her first home by the age of 25, working long hours and striving to create stability. She was someone who pushed forward, even when the path was uphill. In 2010, she met Christopher Watts through Facebook. She wasn't sure about him at first. He seemed quiet, a little too quiet perhaps, but he was persistent in the gentlest way. He drove hours to see her. He brought her meals when she wasn't well. He listened, or at least it seemed that way. They married in 2012. By 2013, they welcomed Bella Marie, beautiful and bright, with wide eyes and soft curls. Celeste, lovingly nicknamed Cece, followed in 2015. Spirited and strong-willed, Cece was the fire to Bella's calm. Together, the girls filled the Watts household with the small, happy chaos of young children. Shanann worked in direct sales for a wellness company called Lavelle. She was good at it, confident, driven, persuasive. Her job involved travel, but also flexibility. It allowed her to stay home with the girls during the week, to cook them breakfast, film their dances, and take them on impromptu zoo visits. Her social media presence, full of motivational quotes and product promotions, was part of the job, but also a reflection of how deeply she believed in creating a positive life, even through struggle. The Watts family looked like something out of a lifestyle blog. Matching Christmas pajamas, chalkboard signs for first days of school, family vacation videos, and yet, even in the most carefully curated corners, there were small shadows, posts about exhaustion, about being the one holding everything together, about missing connection. They didn't scream for attention, they whispered. But that whisper is easier to hear in hindsight. What we know for certain is this: Shanann loved her daughters fiercely. Her texts, videos, and voice messages brimmed with warmth and protectiveness. She guided them with tenderness and structure. She sang to them. She spoke to them with gentleness. She made their lives feel safe. And she wanted to believe in the life she had with Chris. She defended him often, publicly praised him. Privately, she confided in friends that something was shifting, that he had grown distant, cold, preoccupied. But she still hoped, still planned. She was carrying their third child, a son they had already named Nico. She believed this new chapter might bring them closer again. And so, in those last few weeks, she kept documenting, smiling, planning, packing the girls' lunches, making memories, believing maybe that love could find its way back. No one looking at those photos could have known how close the edge was. But it was there, quiet, unseen, waiting. Christopher Watts was, in almost every outward sense, unremarkable. He wasn't the type to raise his voice. He didn't command a room. He wasn't known for dramatic outbursts or unpredictable moods. To neighbors, co-workers, and acquaintances, he seemed mild, polite, steady, the sort of man who kept his lawn trimmed, waved from the driveway, and clocked in quietly at work. Born in Fayetteville, North Carolina, in 1985, Chris was raised in Spring Lake with his sister and parents. Those who knew him growing up remembered a boy who loved sports, particularly NASCAR, and who tinkered with engines in his free time. He was reserved, soft-spoken, the kind of child who seemed to fade into the background, more comfortable in solitude than in social crowds. As an adult, that quietness followed him. He trained as a mechanic, eventually becoming an operator at Anadarko Petroleum in Colorado. It was a stable job with early hours and decent pay. His co-workers described him as reliable, not overly friendly, but not unpleasant, just even. In 2010, he met Shanann through Facebook. She had been hesitant at first, uncertain about letting someone new in, but Chris was patient, gentle. He waited, showed up, earned trust with consistency rather than charm. Their relationship moved quickly. Within 2 years, they were married. Within 5, they had 2 daughters, a house in the suburbs, a dog, a growing family. But underneath that quiet exterior, something else seemed to stir. Chris was never one to open up. He didn't share emotions easily, didn't speak at length about stress or fear. When the family hit financial trouble, filing for bankruptcy in 2015, he didn't confide in friends. When Shanann expressed concern over their marriage, he rarely engaged. He seemed to drift through conflict like mist, avoiding directness, smoothing over tension with silence. Over time, the roles in the relationship settled into place. Shanann, vocal and energetic, often led the charge. She managed the home, the finances, the children's schedules, and the family's public image. Chris, quieter and more passive, seemed to simply go along with it. But those closest to Shanann began to notice a shift in him during the summer of 2018. He lost weight, around 13 kilograms. He changed his wardrobe, started working out more frequently, began spending more time on his phone, guarding it more closely. He seemed distracted, distant, and then, oddly, cold. Text messages between Shanann and her friends reveal her growing concern. She wrote of a man who had stopped being affectionate, who no longer seemed interested in her pregnancy, who barely touched her anymore. She worried aloud that he no longer loved her, that maybe there was someone else. She was right. By that point, Chris had begun a relationship with a woman named Nicole Kessinger, a co-worker at Anadarko. Their relationship started with casual conversations and quickly escalated into a full affair. To Nicole, he presented himself as a man nearing divorce, a father in a crumbling marriage. He never mentioned that Shanann was pregnant. The affair wasn't the cause of what would come next, but it was a match to dry tinder. Chris, once content to stay in the background, began to take center stage in a dangerous internal play, one where perception mattered more than reality, where his life was split in two, the man he appeared to be, and the one he was becoming behind closed doors. In the days leading up to the disappearance, Shanann was away on a business trip. Chris stayed home with the girls. During that time, he brought Nicole to his house, took her out to dinner, spent hours texting her, while also sending loving messages to Shanann. When Shanann returned, she was hopeful. She had written him a long letter on the plane, a plea to reconnect, to rebuild, to be a family again. He never responded. What he did instead would shake the quiet town of Frederick and the nation beyond to its core. It wasn't a dramatic unraveling. There were no public fights, no slammed doors, no bruises or cries for help caught on tape. Instead, the marriage of Chris and Shanann Watts seemed to slowly dissolve beneath the surface, quietly, almost invisibly, like a house settling unevenly until its foundation gives way. From the outside, nothing appeared especially wrong. Their Facebook photos continued to tell a story of unity, family vacations, anniversary posts, smiling snapshots from summer BBQs. But behind the images, a quieter narrative was playing out, one filled with financial tension, emotional disconnect, and a growing void that no amount of shared history could fill. By 2018, the Watts family had been struggling with money for years. Their 2015 bankruptcy had left a trail of unpaid bills and mounting debts. They were behind on their mortgage. Credit cards were maxed. Yet outwardly, they maintained the image of comfort, perhaps clinging to the illusion in hopes it would become truth again. Shanann took on the brunt of the responsibility. Her work with Lavelle had been providing some financial relief, but it also demanded near constant energy. Social media promotion, travel, event hosting, sales tracking. It consumed her attention, all while raising two young girls and managing the household. Chris, meanwhile, became increasingly withdrawn. According to messages shared with close friends, Shanann had begun to feel like she was chasing a ghost. Chris no longer responded with warmth. He seemed distracted, moody. She sensed something was wrong, but each time she asked, he brushed it off, told her he was tired, that everything was fine, but things weren't fine. And Chris wasn't just tired. He was living two lives. At work, he had grown close to Nicole Kessinger. Their relationship, initially friendly, deepened into an affair by late June. Shanann didn't know it yet, but her instincts were already stirring. She noticed changes, the workouts, the phone habits, the sudden interest in appearances. She asked if there was someone else. He denied it. In truth, Chris was becoming increasingly entangled, emotionally, physically, and psychologically, with the fantasy of a different life, one without obligations, without debt, without the wife expecting another child. In this fantasy, he was free. With Nickel, he could rewrite the script of who he was. Not the quiet husband burdened by duty, but a new man with a clean slate. And yet, he still played the part at home. When Shanann traveled to North Carolina with the girls for several weeks over the summer, Chris stayed behind. At first, he sent affectionate texts. He FaceTimed the girls. But gradually, his messages grew shorter, colder. Shanann begged him to open up. She was confused by his silence. Alone in a hotel during a Lavelle event, she broke down to her friends in a string of texts. "He doesn't want this baby," she wrote. "He has changed so much." Still, she held on to hope. She booked a trip to see him in the days ahead. She made plans for a gender reveal. She envisioned a return to closeness, a fresh start before baby Nico arrived. The evening before she flew back, she messaged Chris from the airport. "I'm so ready to be home with you," she wrote. "And I miss your face." He didn't reply. He was with Nickel, having dinner at a restaurant where he paid in cash to avoid detection. Later, he returned to a home that bore no sign of the family he had once built. And then, at 1:48 a.m. on August 13th, a doorbell camera recorded Shanann arriving home. She stepped onto the porch with her suitcase. The night was still. The porch light flickered faintly. It would be the last time she was seen alive. The unraveling was complete. All that remained was the quiet before the storm. The weekend before it all broke open was, on the surface, like many others. Shanann had traveled to Arizona for a Lavelle leadership conference, part work, part retreat, a few days with fellow consultants she knew well. Friends later recalled her seeming distracted during the trip, tired, a little tense. She mentioned that Chris had been distant, that something wasn't sitting right in her gut. Still, she stayed hopeful. She spoke about wanting to reconnect when she got home, about making time for each other, about the baby, Nico, their little boy on the way. She imagined that maybe, with the girls starting school soon and the summer winding down, they could find their rhythm again. As the weekend came to a close, Shanann boarded a red-eye flight back to Colorado. It was late. She was exhausted. Her friend Nicole Atkinson, who had also been on the trip, drove her home from the airport in the early hours of Monday morning, August 13th, 2018. They pulled up to the house just before 2 a.m. The porch camera across the street recorded a brief clip. Shanann stepping onto the walkway, rolling her suitcase, juggling her purse and phone. She opened the door. The porch light flickered once, then silence. Inside the house, the girls, Bella and Celeste, were presumably asleep in their beds. The home was still and dark, and Chris was awake. What happened in those early morning hours is known only through his own words, words that changed over time, shifting with pressure and the weight of consequence. But the truth would begin its long, slow rise from the quiet that followed. By late morning, concern had already begun to grow. Nickel, Shanann's friend and confidant, hadn't heard from her. Shanann had missed a 10 a.m. doctor's appointment, an ultrasound for the baby. That was unlike her. She didn't skip things. She didn't go silent. Nicole drove to the Watts house just after noon. She rang the doorbell, knocked, called. No answer. She noticed Shanann's car still in the garage, her shoes visible by the front door. It didn't feel right. Chris, who claimed to be at work, received messages from her. He responded calmly, said Shanann might be out with the girls, that she'd mentioned something about a play date. But Nicole knew something was wrong. She called the police. At 1:40 p.m., a welfare check was conducted. Body cam footage from the responding officer paints a surreal portrait. The home is quiet, neat, too neat. The bed is stripped. Shanann's belongings, phone, purse, medication are untouched. The children's rooms are still, their blankets folded. Chris arrives shortly after the officer. He's wearing a t-shirt and shorts. His demeanor is strangely subdued. He answers questions, offers theories. Maybe Shanann left on foot. Maybe someone picked her up. He agrees to let police search the home. Throughout the footage, his movements are measured, his voice low and even. But something feels off. Not panicked, not grief-stricken, just flat. The officer speaks with the neighbor across the street, who has security footage from the porch camera. It shows Chris backing his truck into the driveway around 5:15 a.m., an unusual move. He's seen loading items into the back, though the footage doesn't clearly show what. The neighbor, after Chris steps out of earshot, quietly tells the officer that something seems wrong, that Chris is acting strange, that he never backs his truck in like that. His voice is hushed, uneasy. In the coming hours, police would search the house, canvass the area, issue a missing persons alert. Social media would ignite, news vans would arrive, and Chris, still calm, still soft-spoken, would appear on television, pleading for his family's return. But even then, the story was already beginning to crack. The vanishing wasn't sudden. It wasn't violent in the traditional sense. It slipped in under the cover of routine, into the spaces where trust once lived. And all that remained was an empty home, a puzzle community, and a man standing quietly at the center, waiting for the storm to catch him. By the evening of August 13th, the disappearance of Shanann Watts and her two daughters had moved beyond the quiet concern of neighbors. It had become a mystery, the kind of mystery that doesn't announce itself with sirens or shattered windows, but rather with stillness. A woman who simply wasn't where she should have been. A mother whose phone had stopped responding. A home too quiet, too untouched. The police presence at 28025 Saratoga Trail grew by the hour. Officers walked the halls, took photos, noted the details. Shanann's shoes by the door, her car still in the garage, the car seats untouched. Her medication for lupus remained on the counter, unopened. Her phone, found in the couch cushions, was still active, but she hadn't used it. There was no sign of a struggle, no forced entry, no loud noises heard by neighbors. The home looked almost staged, as if the family had stepped out briefly and forgotten to return. Chris was asked to walk through the timeline. He said he left for work early, around 5:15 a.m., and had only briefly spoken with Shanann before that. She'd gotten home late, after all, and he claimed they had a short conversation about their relationship. He said she was emotional, that she might have left with the girls. The story didn't sit right. Friends described Shanann as attentive, dependable, predictable. She wouldn't have skipped her doctor's appointment without telling anyone. She wouldn't have vanished without taking her purse, her phone, her children's things. And she certainly wouldn't have left her medication behind. Still, Chris repeated the same phrases. I just want them back. I don't know where they are. I hope they're safe. He appeared on the local news that night. standing on his front lawn, his arms crossed, his eyes oddly steady. His voice was soft, almost rehearsed. "If you're out there," he said, looking into the camera, "just come back. If somebody has her, please bring her back." But behind the camera, detectives had already begun looking at him differently. They noticed the inconsistencies, the lack of emotion, the way he avoided saying the girls' names, how he kept using past tense when referring to his wife, and how, when faced with increasing scrutiny, he didn't push for answers. He just waited. Over the next 24 hours, the search intensified. Police dogs were brought in. The neighborhood was canvassed again. News coverage expanded. Photos of Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were shared across the country. Candlelight vigils were held. Yellow ribbons appeared on trees. The public watched as a picture-perfect family became a question mark. How could a mother and 2 children disappear without a trace? How could a man so calm be so untouched? Behind the scenes, investigators were already working to chip away at the silence. They interviewed friends, dug into phone records, reviewed security footage. They found that Chris had been texting Nickel Kessinger throughout the day, even as his family was reported missing. They noticed that he hadn't tried calling Shanann after she vanished, that he hadn't reached out to hospitals, friends, or family with any urgency. And still, he maintained his story, until they asked him to take a polygraph. He agreed, and with that, the quiet mystery of the vanished family began to turn, slowly but inevitably, towards something far darker. There's a sound to pressure, though it's often not loud. It's the soft creak of something beginning to give. A slight shift, a fracture invisible at first, but growing. On August 15th, just 2 days after Shanann, Bella, and Celeste were reported missing, Chris Watts walked into the Frederick Police Department and sat down for a polygraph test. The room was cool, neutral, no flashing lights, just a table, a chair, and a quiet technician named Tammy Lee. Chris agreed to the test voluntarily. He said he had nothing to hide. But polygraphs don't measure lies. They measure stress, disruption, the invisible tension that bubbles beneath the surface when someone's story begins to separate from what they know to be true. Tammy asked simple questions. Do you know where Shanann is? Did you physically cause her disappearance? Are you lying about the last time you saw her? Each time, Chris answered no. Each time, the machine told a different story. After the test, Tammy returned to the room and faced him gently, not with accusation, but with a calm firmness. It's clear you're not telling the truth, she said softly. These results don't look good. Chris stayed silent. He shifted in his chair, rubbed his hands together. His composure, so steady for days, began to wobble. The pauses between his words grew longer. The clarity of his answers began to dissolve. Detectives joined Tammy in the room. They encouraged him to tell the truth, not all at once, just to start. Something happened, they said. You need to tell us what. Chris put his head in his hands. His breathing changed. He looked tired. For the first time, the weight of everything began to show. He asked to speak to his father. When Ronnie Watts arrived, the room quieted. Chris leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. He spoke haltingly, stumbling through tears and tangled sentences. And then he told a version of the story. A version where Shanann had killed the girls. A version where he had flown into a rage, then killed her in return. It wasn't the truth, but it was a crack, a hairline fracture that widened by the hour. That same evening, Chris was arrested on suspicion of murder. The next day, the search for Shanann, Bella, and Celeste came to an end. Chris had directed investigators to an oil site owned by Anadarko Petroleum, where he worked. There, in the vast stillness of the Colorado plains, they found what remained of the family. Shanann's body had been buried in a shallow grave. Nearby, submerged inside separate oil tanks, were Bella and Celeste. It was a discovery that shook even the most experienced investigators. Not for its gore, but for its quiet cruelty. For the chilling care with which Chris had hidden them. For the stillness of it all. There had been no frantic escape, no fight for freedom, only a calm departure. A man leaving for work, dropping bodies along the way, then returning home to play the part of the concerned husband. In those moments, the narrative collapsed. The smiling father from Facebook became something else entirely. A man whose silence had never meant stability, but concealment. And all that was left was to piece together how the mask had stayed on for so long. Truth doesn't always arrive cleanly. Sometimes it comes in fragments. Whispered, deflected, revised. That's how it came from Christopher Watts. In the hours after his arrest, Chris told investigators a partial story, one that cast himself not as the instigator, but the responder. A version in which he claimed to have found Shanann smothering the girls, and in a moment of blind grief, lashed out and killed her. It was a lie, but it was the beginning. Investigators pressed gently, knowing more would come. They had already uncovered enough to refute his story. There were no signs that Shanann had harmed the children, no defensive wounds, no evidence to support his claim. Still, they let the silence work. Let time do what it does best. Erode the walls. Over the weeks that followed, Chris remained in jail. The media swirled. The public reacted with outrage and sorrow. But Chris was quiet, mostly alone. And in that solitude, his version of events began to shift again. Then, in early November, nearly 3 months after the murders, Chris accepted a plea deal. In exchange for removing the death penalty from the table, he agreed to plead guilty to all charges. 5 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 3 counts of tampering with a deceased human body. There was no trial, no jury, no cross-examination, only a courtroom heavy with grief, and a man in an orange jumpsuit sitting silently at a table while families wept behind him. The prosecutor read the charges aloud. Chris stood and answered each with a low, steady, guilty. He didn't look back, didn't cry, didn't speak beyond what was required. But months later, in a rare interview conducted from prison, he would finally tell the story in full. It was February 2019, when agents from the FBI and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation returned to question him again. This time, Chris spoke for hours, and what he said was chilling not in his brutality, but in his calm. He described waking up early on August 13th, lying in bed beside Shanann, feeling distant, then straddling her body, pressing his hands around her neck. He said she didn't scream, that she never fought back. Afterward, he wrapped her in a sheet, As he did, Bella and Celeste entered the room. They asked what was wrong with Mommy. Chris said nothing. He loaded Shanann's body into his truck, put the girls in the back seat, drove to the oil site. During the ride, he said Bella asked, "Is Mommy okay?" He told her yes. Then, one by one, he smothered the girls with their own blankets. First Celeste, then Bella, who he claimed begged him, softly, "Daddy, no." He placed their small bodies into separate oil tanks, buried Shanann nearby. Then he drove to work, pretending it was just another day. The details are unbearable, not because of their graphic nature, but because of their quietness. The stillness with which each moment unfolded, the absence of panic, the sheer soft horror of a man, calm and composed, making irreversible choices with a hollow heart. When asked why, Chris struggled to answer. He spoke of feeling trapped, of wanting to be with Nickel, of snapping. But none of it held weight. The truth was simpler and sadder. He wanted out of the life he had built, and instead of stepping away, he erased it. What remains is a series of unimaginable moments sealed in still air and empty rooms. A story that slipped beneath the surface of ordinary days, undetected until it broke through. And once it did, the facade shattered completely. The courtroom was quiet. There were no outbursts, no impassioned speeches. Just the shuffle of papers, the soft hum of fluorescent lights, and the heavy breath of grief filling the space between every word spoken. On November 19th, 2018, Christopher Watts stood before a Colorado judge to be sentenced. He had pleaded guilty just weeks earlier, waiving his right to a trial, choosing instead to accept his punishment in exchange for sparing his life. He wore an orange jumpsuit and shackles. His hands remained folded in front of him. His eyes stayed downcast for most of the hearing. Across the room, the family sat in painful silence. Shanann's parents, Frank and Sandra Ruchek, devastated and composed. Chris's parents, subdued and distant. The air was thick with the kind of sorrow that doesn't cry out, but rather settles deep into the bones. Prosecutors laid out the facts. They described a man who had murdered his pregnant wife and 2 daughters in cold silence, who had driven their bodies to a remote oil site, who had hidden them with care, returned home, and calmly played the role of the grieving husband. They spoke not of monsters, but of cowardice, of a man who had chosen the path of erasure rather than confrontation, who had made a decision with no do-over, no reason that could ever make sense. Then, Shanann's family spoke. Frank Rizuchek, her father, stood trembling, his voice low and shaking. He spoke of his daughter's laughter, her strength, the way she loved her children, how he would never again feel her hug, never hear Celeste's giggle or Bella's sweet voice calling him Poppy. He told the court that the pain was endless, that the loss had shattered their family in a way that could never be mended. When Sandra, Shanann's mother, spoke, she didn't raise her voice. She didn't scream. She spoke through tears about a hole in her heart, about how Chris had sat at her kitchen table, smiling, pretending to care, while knowing what he had done. The judge called it perhaps the most inhumane and vicious crime he had ever seen. He sentenced Chris Watts to 5 life sentences, 3 to be served consecutively, 2 concurrently. There would be no possibility of parole. He was also given 48 years for unlawful termination of a pregnancy, and 36 years for 3 counts of tampering with a body. Chris didn't speak. He didn't apologize. Not then. He was led from the courtroom, head down, into the custody of the Colorado Department of Corrections. For a while, he was held in a prison in Colorado, but due to security concerns, largely stemming from threats by other inmates, he was quietly transferred out of state. Eventually, he would end up at Dodge Correctional Institution in Walpon, Wisconsin. There, he would spend 23 hours a day in a small, windowless cell. He would eat alone, walk alone, think alone, and the world would move on. Sort of. Because some stories don't fade with the headlines. They linger, especially the ones that appear at first to be so ordinary. A husband, a wife, 2 small children, a growing family, a quiet house, a silent morning, and a truth that, once uncovered, left behind a silence far louder than any scream. After the sentencing, Christopher Watts disappeared from the public eye. The man who had once stood in his driveway pleading for his family's return, who had gone on national television with practiced calm, now existed behind concrete walls and steel doors. His world had shrunk to a cell, a cot, and the unrelenting sound of nothing. But even in that silence, his name did not fade. Interest in the case continued to swell. Documentaries were released. Interviews were analyzed. True crime communities pored over timelines, text messages, and video footage. What fascinated many wasn't just the crime. It was the quiet normalcy that preceded it. The mask that Chris had worn so convincingly. From prison, Chris remained mostly withdrawn, but not entirely. In early 2019, months after his sentencing, he agreed to a long interview with agents from the FBI and Colorado Bureau of Investigation. In it, he gave the full confession, his last version of events. The details, soft and unsettling, have haunted many ever since. He admitted that there had been no confrontation, no argument. He simply made a decision and followed through with it, step by step. When asked why he didn't simply leave, why he didn't ask for a divorce, Chris could offer no explanation that made sense. He mumbled about wanting freedom, about fear, about being in a dark place. None of it felt sufficient. Not for the crime, not for the silence he'd carried for days afterward. In prison, Chris is held in protective custody. He spends most of his time alone, for his own safety. Inmates who kill children are often targets, and so his world is small, repetitive, monitored. Still, he receives letters, some from strangers expressing anger, others surprisingly from people offering forgiveness, some even from admirers, those inexplicably drawn to notorious figures. Chris responds to some of them, often quoting scripture, reflecting on his crimes through a religious lens, talking about guilt, redemption, the soul. He keeps photos of his daughters in his cell. He reportedly reads the Bible often, prays, writes in a journal. In interviews, he's spoken about his dreams, how he sometimes sees Shanann, Bella, and Celeste in them, how he wakes up crying, how he believes they visit him. But whether these reflections are sincere or simply part of a new mask is a question no one can truly answer. The one person who might have understood him best, Shanann, is gone, and the rest of us are left to examine the echoes. Not the crime itself, but the quiet void it left behind. The eerie realization that someone can wear peace like a costume, that darkness can live behind the calmest eyes, that a family so seemingly ordinary could vanish in an instant, and that the person responsible might never fully understand why he did it. Chris's story doesn't end with bars or Bibles or broadcast interviews. It ends in stillness, a stillness that continues to hum in the background long after the headlines fade. There's something particularly unsettling about a crime that wears a quiet face. We often expect darkness to announce itself, to arrive with fury, chaos, a raised voice in the night. But sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it walks softly, smiles politely, clocks in on time, says, "I love you," while already imagining the world without you in it. Christopher Watts was not a man who looked like danger. He wasn't loud, angry, or erratic. He didn't carry a criminal record or wear a scowl. He was ordinary, a neighbor, a co-worker, a father. And that's what made his story so chilling. It reminds us that harm doesn't always come crashing through the door. Sometimes it sleeps beside you. Sometimes it eats dinner with you, kisses your children goodnight, and says everything's fine, right up until the moment it isn't. What happened to Shanann, Bella, Celeste, and baby Nico wasn't just a tragedy. It was a collapse of something deeply human. Trust. Trust in the people closest to us. Trust in love as a safe harbor. Trust that if things fall apart, they'll fall apart honestly. With heartbreak perhaps, but not with erasure. Chris didn't just kill his family. He dismantled an entire narrative, one that had been carefully built, online and off, of love, growth, and family. And in doing so, he left behind a silence louder than any confession. Today, Saratoga Trail stands much the same. A house with closed curtains. A mailbox no longer checked. The porch light flickers on at dusk, just as it did that August morning. But inside, the echoes remain. For those who remember Shanann, Bella, and Celeste, the memories live on in softer tones. A little girl's laugh, a mother's arms, a quiet hope for a better tomorrow. This story doesn't end with monsters in the shadows. It ends with a lesson, whispered and still, that sometimes the greatest storms come not with thunder, but in silence. Thank you for spending this time with the Dozing Detective. May you sleep in peace tonight, knowing that in remembering, we give voice to those who can no longer speak, and in our